Welcome everyone, and I'm sorry for the few moment delay there. We had just a brief technical issue. My name is Nikki Johnston. I'm with Transition Advisors, and our webinar today is Growing Your Firm Through M&A. Before we begin, we need to cover just a few important items. First, please take a moment to close any other programs that you have running on your computer. This will help to ensure quality presentation and reduce any audio issues. Transition Advisors LLC is a proud and approved sponsor on the National Registry of CPA Sponsors per NASBA. Under NASBA's guidelines, today's 60-minute session will qualify for 1.2 CPE credits. In order to receive your 1.2 CPE, you must complete two requirements. The first is that you participate in all 4 of the polling questions throughout the presentation, and please note that GoToWebinar does monitor your participation in those polls. We will be able to issue partial credit of 1 CPE for those who answer 3 out of 4 of the polling questions. Next, you'll also need to complete an online evaluation. That will appear on your screen after the webinar ends, so please take a few moments to complete that before you close your browser at the end of the session. Once you've met both of those requirements, I will send you your CPE certificate by email within 10 business days. Now, in order to fully participate in the webinar, please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the GoToWebinar control panel. You should see it on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow near the top. You can use that to minimize the panel if you wish. During the presentation, all participants are muted, but you can communicate with us by using the question box toward the bottom of the control panel. Just type your question in that box and click send. Terry will also be sharing his webcam during today's presentation. You are welcome to resize it, to minimize it, or even to close it if you wish. You'll see a double bar in between his webcam and the slides that you can use to resize it if you'd like. Finally, I'd like to remind you that Transition Advisors offers a free CPE webinar each month. You'll see some of our upcoming sessions there on the screen. Next month, we have a 2 CPE class, which is on succession planning and valuing your firm. That's on September 28th. And then in October and November, we have 2 brand new webinars, case studies on internal succession of retiring partners and keys to due diligence and client retention. To register for these or any of our other sessions, you can go to the CPE courses section of transitionadvisors.com. Now, I'd like to remind you that in the email that you received from GoToWebinar, there was a link to download today's presentation. I just resent that link to you via the chat box. If you'd like for me to send it to you as a PDF attached to an email, just shoot me an email at that email address on your screen. You can also reach me simply by replying to any of those reminder emails that you got from GoToWebinar. Those go directly to me. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's session. Terry Putney is the CEO of Transition Advisors. Thanks so much and enjoy the webinar.
There I am. Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for attending today. And is the webcam still up, Nikki? Because I just clicked off.
Yes, Terry, it is. We can still see you and the slides.
Okay, good. I'm not sure that's a good thing or not. You'll have to decide for yourself. Transition Advisors is a national consulting firm. We work exclusively with accounting firms on issues only related to ownership transition. That falls into 2 general categories. We work on a significant number of mergers and acquisitions, which includes everything involved finding firms for you to talk to if you're in an acquisition mode, or if you turn out to be in an upstream merger or selling mode, we find firms for you to talk to as well. And then we support the transaction all the way through to closing, including every step of the way. We customize how we work with each of our clients depending on what their needs are. Some of our clients use us for everything. Some of our clients only use us for a part of the process because they have experience doing this and have other means of getting support. The other large area we work in is working on owner agreements and succession planning. I'm really excited about the webinar that I'll be presenting next in October on the case studies for succession planning and owner agreements. I've worked on about 25 of those projects last year and have some pretty good examples, I think, of situations we've run into and how we dealt with them. So if you have any interest in that at all, think about joining us for that webinar. Today we're going to address these issues with respect to how to grow your firm through merger and acquisition. That assumes that you're in an acquisition mode, that you're looking to buy or merge in other firms. The importance of a business plan and how to develop that. What are the 4 C's and how important they are to the success of your transaction. How to figure out if a firm's a good fit for your firm, a good fit for your acquisition, what the deal process is, how to manage that, and then issues related to deal structure. We're going to start off with a polling question because we do have 4 of these to go through, and I'd like to get an idea of who's on the line. So I'll turn it back over to Nikki.
Okay, the first polling question is there on the screen. How many equity partners do you have in your firm? I'll give everyone just a few moments to answer this first question. Okay, just one more moment. I'll go ahead and close the poll. There we go. Looks like we've got nearly everyone. So I'll share the results. Terry, 43% of those on the call have just 1 equity partner. 43% are in that 2 to 4 range. 9%, 5 to 9, and then the remaining 4% are in a 20 plus.
Okay, very good. So that tells me that for those of you that are sole proprietors, your interest might be either in acquiring another firm to deal with your own succession or maybe spur your growth, or in some cases maybe you're just interested in pursuing an upstream merger yourself and want to see it from the other side. But I think you'll find value in this whichever way you're looking at it. When it comes to the business plan, it's the issue. One of the issues here is making sure that you get all of your partners and the other people involved in this process all on the same page. We've run into a lot of situations where a managing partner of a firm or maybe a couple of partners in the firm are pursuing mergers and acquisitions, really haven't done a very good job of positioning that within their firm. So when they actually bring a deal to the firm for consideration, everybody's not on the same page on even why we're doing this, and therefore how to evaluate the opportunity. So I think it's important to develop a formal business plan up front. You want to identify what your strategic goals are. There's some examples here of what those are, and each of these has its own unique opportunity or unique issues. If your primary goal is for general revenue and client growth, it could be that maybe a merger is really not the right answer for you, meaning a merger means bringing in new partners. You're really looking for just more clients and not new partners. You're trying to increase your profitability, maybe the value of your firm. On the other hand, your goal may be to increase the number of partners because you have your own succession issues and you'd like to build a stronger firm to deal with retiring partners that will be retiring in the near future. If you're looking at entering new geographic markets, you've got an issue with respect to how you're going to operate in those markets, how you're going to manage them. That will dictate the kind of firm that you acquire and how much you rely on the management team in that firm and so forth. So it's very important that you have a pretty good understanding of what it is you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it, and understand what the consequences are of those decisions. Basically, merger gets used as a loose term in this area. A merger means you're admitting new equity partners. You're adding new owners to your firm. Partners in the firm you're acquiring are exchanging the equity in their firm for equity in your firm, as opposed to a purchase. Now, we recommend that any transaction like this be held out to the public as a merger. Clients don't like to be told that they've been sold to somebody, but the legal structure of the deal obviously is very different in a true merger where new people are signing on to your current owner agreement, as opposed to an acquisition where you're not admitting new partners. Our rule of thumb of when to use one or the other depends on the career goals of the partners of the firm you're acquiring. So generally, if those partners are going to only want to stay around for 5 or fewer years, it's generally better not to do a merger where you're issuing new equity. It's better to negotiate those terms more in the form of an acquisition. On the other hand, if you're looking for partners to stay around for more than 5 years, it's probably a good idea to consider whether or not you should do a merger and admit new owners. A lot of transactions in multi-partner firms will be a combination. We've seen transactions where we've got one partner who might be only a year or less away from wanting to leave or slow down substantially. With respect to that partner's needs, maybe the best transaction is almost to treat it as an immediate sale, which generally has an impact on how you pay that partner for that short period of time they continue to work. You might have several partners that are short timers, meaning 5 or fewer years, but probably more than just a few months. And in those partners, we're looking at what we'll call a two-stage deal, which we'll discuss in greater detail later on. And then maybe a few partners that are actually merger candidates. So it's not unusual at all to have a combination of those three. What does the market look like right now? Everybody keeps asking, is it a buyer or seller's market? And it really depends on, certainly the market has changed. When we were looking at the economy we had in 2008, 2009, 2010, when growth was very difficult for most firms, without a doubt, it was more of a seller's market because there was so much interest in firms acquiring other firms to make up for the growth that they weren't enjoying organically. Nowadays, I'd say it really depends on the market and the size of the firm. If you're a small firm in a very small market where you have very few opportunities to talk to other firms, it's probably never been a seller's market. It's always been a buyer's market. You pretty much have to deal with what you have available to you. On the other hand, if you're a mid-sized firm or small to mid-sized firm in a very large market, say you're a firm of $1 million or less, 500,000 to say 2 million, let's use that as an example, in New York or a large East Coast city or even on the West Coast, you have almost always been a seller's market because there's so many firms that are interested in acquiring books of business of that size. On the other hand, if you're a $10 to $20 million firm, whereas maybe 5-6 years ago it was more of a seller's market for you, we're finding now, because there are so many firms of that size that are seeking upstream mergers, and there are so many firms that have acquired firms of that size already to establish a presence in a new market, to some extent it's actually become a buyer's market. So it really depends on your situation and where you're located. Other thing I'd point out is this issue of bottom feeding. I've had several clients tell me that they perceive that the market has flipped to the extent that they can pay much lower multiples for acquisitions that they make, and I'm not saying that that's not true. But on the other hand, sometimes you want to be careful what you wish for, or you get what you pay for, actually. So if you're out there trying to do every deal at 70 cents on the dollar or 80 cents on the dollar, and sometimes the firms that you're talking to that are willing to do that may not be your best opportunity. So I think it's important to remain flexible, not go in with any preconceived notions, and deal with each opportunity as it comes up. And in some cases, you may find yourself having to pay more than you thought to get the right opportunity. When you're dealing with an acquisition primarily, the thing that the point I want to get across here for the rest of this presentation is that your business plan for the transition of that practice is the most important issue that you should be focusing on, not necessarily the terms of the deal. What's going to dictate whether or not the deal is successful is how well you transition that practice, both the clients and the staff and partners, to your firm. And I think that doesn't get enough attention in some cases. We get so caught up in the financial terms that we forget that there's a business plan behind this transaction that has to be executed. And I don't care how good the deal terms are for you, if the business plan fails, the transaction is going to fail. So just keep that in mind as we go through this presentation, that's really behind that's the concept that's behind a lot of what I'm going to say. What are the 4 C's? Well, these are the 4 C's, and I think that these are really, when you think about the business plan behind the transaction, this is really what you need to focus on. So the first thing is the chemistry, and what we're really talking about there is the personalities of the parties involved. So, one of our rules of thumb or one of our taglines is, if you're sitting across from somebody at a meeting, and you can't imagine yourself having lunch with that person on a regular basis just because you don't really hit it off with them, you don't like them that well. Don't do the deal. Walk away from that, because personalities not only will impact whether or not you get along with that individual, but they probably also reflect the personalities of the people that are important to that firm. For instance, its staff and clients. You know, birds of a feather flock together. So if you find that you're having difficulty relating to somebody on a personal level that's key to the transaction, consider whether or not you really should go forward. Capacity, first thing that comes to mind when you think of capacity is probably office load. You know, how big is the office? Do we have space to move people into? But the reality is that capacity really goes across the whole firm's operations. For instance, in most transactions, there's a succession element involved. That's what's driving most firms that are seeking an upstream merger or a sale, which means you're going to have to replace partner time, which in some cases can be a very significant amount of the firm's resources. For instance, in a $600,000 or $700,000 sole proprietor, that partner might be producing as much as half or even more of the billable time. So your ability to replace that partner's time, that partner's role, is a capacity issue. You know, so think about capacity not only in terms of space, but also expertise, productive capacity, staff that might be leaving, and so forth. Continuity really addresses the issue of how much change you're going to introduce to the practice and how fast you're going to introduce it. So if you've got a situation where the firm you're talking to is significantly differently, operating significantly differently than you, and you need to make that change, and it's going to have to happen fairly quickly, you've got a somewhat of a heightened risk with respect to client retention. So consider the continuity factor, and it's not only how much change is going to happen, but can you postpone some of it to make it more gradual. And finally, culture. I think most of us have heard that a lot of deals that don't work out are because of culture clashes, and it's hard sometimes to define what that means. I mean, we walk into an office, we kind of get a feel for culture, but how do you really pin it down? I found that the best way to do that is to ask yourself 3 questions. What's it like to be a client in this firm versus your firm? What's it like to be a staff person in this firm versus your firm? And what's it like to be a partner in this firm versus your firm? And when you do that, you start being able to sort of operationalize or put some meat on the bone as to what it really means culturally. So for instance, if you're asking staff in your firm, maybe you have a policy that staff in your firm are only going to work, say, 55 hours a week during tax season, and maybe your goal is for them to have 1,500 or 1,600 billable hours a year. But you're talking to a firm that has more of a policy of staff working 70, 80, 90 hours a week during tax season with 1,800, 1,900 billable hours a year. There's a significant cultural difference between those 2 firms. And if that's an indication of where you're going to have cultural clashes, you may have a difficulty with transitioning that practice. With that, Nikki, I'm going to turn it back to you for a second for another polling question.
Okay, the second polling question is on your screen. This one is about your current level of interest in M&A. So your options here are that you're experienced and currently looking, you're not experienced but you are actively looking, you're not sure, you're intrigued, or you're just not sure. And this is our second polling question. We'll have 4 total. All 4 are required to get the full 1.2 CPE. If you missed the first one, you can still get 1 CPE credit by answering the remaining 3. All right, that's nearly everyone. We'll go ahead and close the poll, share the results there. So we've got a pretty good split. 42% are not sure, they're intrigued. 27% have no experience, but they are actively looking. 23% are experienced and looking. And then the remaining 8% picked the not sure option.
Okay. Well, hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of whether or not this is something for you. You'll notice that in the middle of that, my Salesforce window popped up on the screen. That's a good example of why you should close out all your programs. I didn't do it, so I apologize for that. In assessing the fit of a firm that you're talking to, a target firm, think about looking at it in these 4 general categories. And we'll discuss each of these in the next few slides. So with respect to clients, all of us would like to think that we're going to acquire a client base in an acquisition or merger that are all round pegs fitting in our round holes. And the reality is that's never going to happen. My rule of thumb is that you should be able to accommodate, there's a certain amount of client difference that you can't accommodate. You may have, we worked with a firm recently in California, and it turns out that the client base, we didn't know this until we got kind of into the transaction, didn't close, needless to say. The client base had a heavy emphasis on the adult entertainment industry, and that client base was unacceptable. Probably, I can't think of very many of our clients that would have found that acceptable. So there are examples where the client base, the nature of the client base is such that it just isn't a fit for you. But the rule of thumb is that you're going to find some parts of the client base you'd rather not have. A typical example is low-end 1040s. We run into that quite a bit. The smaller the firm, the more likely they are to have that kind of client. Our rule of thumb is that if you have up to 25% of the client base that might not be ideal but is somewhat acceptable, that's probably a reasonable goal. More than that, you're starting to look at a practice that maybe isn't a very good fit for you. When you think about what to do with that, oftentimes we can come up with a transition plan of how to, maybe rehabilitate. Let's use the 1040s as an example. Maybe we can raise the fees on enough of that client, of the ones that are too low end, that we can actually retain a reasonable amount of that business, even though we might lose some clients out of it. And as long as you have a joint plan in place with the seller, and this is an open goal for you to go through this transition, it should work out. When it comes to services, you pretty much have to be able to offer all the services that the clients of the firm you're acquiring are used to getting. So either be ready to do that, or in some cases we can carve out a part of the part of the practice that isn't a fit for you. One example is peer reviews. There are smaller firms out there that do peer reviews as a means of enhancing their revenue during the off season. A lot of larger firms we work with aren't interested in doing that kind of work. So one recent transaction we were involved in, we allowed the seller, who was not going to be around forever, to retain that part of the practice, operate it on the side while they're part of our firm, and then continue to operate it after they left. And then service methodologies is another issue, and this is becoming more and more of an issue because of technology. Maybe your environment is that you interact with your clients regularly on a digital basis, whereas the firm you're talking to is used to meeting with clients in their offices face-to-face a lot. That's a pretty big change in the client experience, and maybe indicates a firm that isn't a good fit for yours. Another issue tends to be mobility for staff, can also be an issue. Partners, when it comes to assessing the fit with partners, first off, if you're dealing with a seller of someone who's not going to be around for more than a little while, the cultural differences between the firms really aren't that big a deal. You can accommodate the fact that maybe the guy takes most of the summer off, maybe takes 20 weeks a year of vacation. Who cares? If he's only going to be around for a couple years and you're not paying him or her as a partner, then you're paying them more based on the outcome of their practice, then it really doesn't matter that that's way different than the policies that you have for your firm. The accountability isn't as big a deal. We're primarily focused on transitioning the client base. But in a merger, needless to say, cultural differences are very important, and we'll talk about some of those here in just a minute. We're going to talk later on, again, this is the second time I brought up two-stage deals. Two-stage deals are kind of a hybrid, and depending on how long the stage one is of the two-stage deal, and stage one is when the partner is continuing to work in your firm on a full-time basis, and how big the difference is in culturally, it can make a difference. But in a lot of cases, we try to deal with a two-stage deal similar to an acquisition. So in mergers, one of the things to consider here is the leverage. You know, in larger firms, what we refer to as leverage is the number of staff persons per partner. So in a larger firm, leverage can be 8 to 10 to 12 to 1, meaning, you know, as many as 10 staff people for every partner. Whereas in much smaller firms, leverage oftentimes can be 1 to 1, 2 to 1, 3 to 1. And why is that important? Well, that leverage is an indication of the partner role and how involved the partners are face-to-face, hands-on with their clients, which is a very important cultural issue. So if partners are used to doing most of the work themselves, putting them in an environment where partners are used to delegating a lot of the work can be a difficult change. So that's something to consider. It doesn't mean it can't be overcome. The issue there is to make sure you've had a conversation about that issue and there's a plan in place to make the change and a willingness to do that. Productivity is another issue in a merger. You know, in some firms, again, in these low leverage firms, oftentimes the partners have very high chargeable hours. And in higher leverage firms, they tend to have lower billable hours. So again, that's an indication of role. It also could be an indication of work ethic. I mean, you know, if your partners are used to working, you know, 2,500, 2,600 hours a year, you're merging with a firm where the partners don't put anywhere near that many hours in, that can be a difficult issue long term. Accountability, how autonomous, how accountable are your partners to the firm's management as opposed to having free reign. And then when you consider this cultural issue with partners, think about what you value, and a lot of times that'll be resonant in your partner compensation system. So for instance, if you're paying partners for the size of their books of business, or you're paying partners for how productive they are in their own billable time, maybe you're paying a fairly high commission rate or indirectly, in essence, paying for practice development activities. Those are all cultural issues, and if that's way different than the firm that you're talking to, you may have a problem with assimilation. When it comes to staff, first thing to keep in mind is if the clients, the services, the fees, and the quality of the work of the firm you're talking to are all acceptable, that probably means the staff is acceptable too. You can rely on the fact that even though they might look different, there might be some differences there that you need to deal with. For the most part, you've got a staff resource that is probably going to fit in. Employment agreements become an issue a lot of times in mergers and acquisitions. A lot of smaller firms don't have employment agreements for their staff, and so this is the first time they've been asked to sign something, and the big issue, of course, is any restrictive covenants in those agreements, which is generally why you would have an employment agreement. So making sure you get that issue out on the table fairly soon. You and the partners of the firm you're acquiring have a plan in place as to how to get those agreements signed. Deal with what are we going to do if somebody won't sign them. Depends on who it is, of course. Sometimes you'll run into situations with staff where the partners haven't done a good job of disclosing to you that some of the client relationships are actually controlled by non-partners. This can turn into, needless to say, an issue if there is an unwillingness on the part of the staff that have that attribute to go along with the deal. So make sure as you're doing your due diligence and as you're evaluating the firm, that you take into account the fact that that might exist. When it comes to compensation and benefits, the issue here is to make sure that you don't expect staff of the firm you're acquiring to take a cut in pay or take a step back. So, for instance, a lot of times benefits are different between firms. Sometimes you can make that up with money. For instance, maybe you don't pay for the same level of health insurance, or maybe you don't offer as much paid time off as the staff of a firm you're acquiring. Sometimes you can make a compensation adjustment there. And anything that you have to do to keep compensation whole that might be out of sync with your compensation system, it's not a long-term issue. You might have somebody who have to pay $80,000 to that you'd rather be paying $65,000 to in your system. In a year or two, that's not going to make a difference. So it's really important to understand that sometimes staff retention is directly related also to client retention. So it's worth it to make some accommodations up front sometimes in order to keep the client retention high. When it comes to infrastructure, office facilities is usually a big issue. Most buyers prefer not to open new offices if they can avoid it, unless that's their strategic objective. For instance, if your goal is to expand your geographic reach into a new market or a new area of your existing market, then of course you do want a new office. But a lot of times we find buyers prefer to move acquired practices into their existing offices. The issue is if you're too inflexible on that, you're probably going to reduce the amount of firms that are available to you for a potential deal significantly by maybe as much as 80% reduction. The issue comes up of unexpired leases, the continuity issue if the firm has staff or clients that are geographically sensitive. And so being flexible and understanding that maybe we operate for a couple years in another office that will eventually vacate, will help you be relevant to a lot more firms. Another thing to consider here is that even though you might consider the acquired firm's space redundant with space you already have, you're not going to be increasing the combined firm's cost structure by continuing to operate in that location for a while. So you might be giving up an opportunity cost or an opportunity to reduce costs, but you're not going to increase costs by continuing to operate there. When it comes to technology, this has really become somewhat of a cultural issue. If you're, for instance, paperless, which a lot of our clients are nowadays, and you're talking to a firm that isn't paperless, the issue, there certainly is an investment involved in bringing that practice on board with yours, but more of the bigger issue is the cultural issue. Are they willing to work with you and assimilate to your technology environment or not? Are they going to resist that? So when it comes to technology, you're going to make an investment no matter what you do. Most firms smaller firms don't have the technology that's robust enough to work in your environment. So there's going to be a technology investment. That's really not the issue. It's the cultural issue in their environment. With that, Nikki, I'm going to turn it back over for our third polling question.
Okay, our third polling question is, does your firm have an owner agreement? Here your options are yes, and it's signed by all current owners. Yes, but not everyone has signed it. No, you need one. No, you're not sure you need one. And as Terry mentioned, this is our third poll. We'll have one more after this. And you do need to answer at least 3 out of the 4 to get your CPE today. Okay, I'll go ahead and close the poll. Nearly everyone voting. 46% say they don't and they aren't sure they need one. 31% do have one signed by everyone, and then the other 2 options are split evenly, 12% each for yes, but not everyone signed it, no, but we do need one.
Okay, let me just divert for a second because I didn't really have this as part of my presentation, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. When it comes to this issue of owner agreements, if you're going to do a merger, meaning you're going to bring people into your firm as a new owner, you have to have an owner agreement that's going to appeal to them. And for those of you that don't have one, if you're thinking about doing any kind of acquisition, you're not going to be able to do it if you don't have an owner agreement. You're not going to be able to do a merger if you don't have an owner agreement. This is a big issue in a lot of situations. I'm dealing right now with a firm. It's a good-sized firm, $15 million firm, 9 partners. One of the partners owns 65% of the equity. And, that's not a problem generally, but it could be, it's starting to become a problem because, we're trying to merge another firm in, about a $2.5 million firm. And they're going to be owners in this firm. And fortunately, our client recognized that their existing owner agreement was going to be potentially an impediment for them to do any mergers. So simultaneously with us negotiating the deal with the firm that they're acquiring, we're also redoing their owner agreement. And we're primarily addressing what happens after the 65% partner leaves in about 4 years. So that's what's driving the changes. So your owner agreement is an important part of any transaction that involves bringing in new owners, and you really need to make sure that it's in a position where you can use that as a tool, a positive tool in the transaction. 7-step, and for those of you that are sole proprietors, obviously you don't need an owner agreement unless you have partners. If you're going to have partners, you're going to need an owner agreement. So feel free to, be happy to talk to you about what that means and how you might address that if you're interested. Okay, the 7-step process, most of this isn't rocket science. What is important in this is not only what these steps are, but the order that we do them in. When it comes to identifying target firms, you can work with a firm like ours. We're a consulting firm, and we'll find opportunities for you to talk to. I mean, it depends on where you're located and how difficult that might be, but be happy to talk to you more about that. The advantage of working with a consulting firm like us is that we get pretty good coverage across the market. I mean, we're going to be talking to, depending on the situation, many of the firms in that market, or at least attempting to. And so you get much better opportunity to get full coverage of the opportunities there. Networking tends to be a little bit serendipitous, meaning you sort of run into opportunities. Maybe you know of some already, but you don't know what you don't know, and so you don't know who you're not talking to. You should be. Although that is a way that increasingly, because firms are more willing to be open about the fact that they're seeking either a merger or a merger for acquisition purposes or an upstream merger, certainly is a lot more. It's easier to have those kind of conversations than it was, say, 10 years ago. We don't think advertising works really well. Putting an ad in the local state society magazine, for instance, hasn't been, in our experience, hasn't been a great way to go, but it is something that a lot of firms still do. So once you've identified the firm that you are interested in talking to, this is the preliminary data that we think you need to get out on the table as quickly as you can. It's really a form of due diligence. It gives you the information you need to understand all the things we've talked about up to now in terms of fit. So, how much volume is the firm doing, obviously? What kind of breakdown do they have between their business clients and individual clients, and then breakdown also in terms of industries, industry concentrations, the types of services being provided. If they have any major clients, and I would consider a major client anybody that's more than 10% of their volume. In some smaller firms, you'll find clients sometimes that make up as much as 40 or 50% of the volume. Needless to say, that's a very unique situation that requires special treatment. It can be a very good opportunity. It also presents a significant concentration of risk. What's the staff makeup? What's the partner makeup? And what you're looking for there is how much ownership does each partner have? What kind of compensation are they being paid? What are their career plans? What's their role in the firm? How big a book of business are they managing? What services do they offer? Who runs the firm? Who provides administrative services or administrative role and so forth? What kind of billing rates do they have at the partner level and the staff level? What's the details around their lease? How much longer does it have to run? Do they own their own space? And of course, the profitability of the firm, which is defined as their profits before any owner compensation. This is the kind of data that we always get on the sellers that we find for you initially, and it's how we help you evaluate whether you even want to have a first meeting. In the event that you find your own opportunities, of course, this is data that you'll want to ask for or at least discuss in a first meeting, but at the same time be prepared to provide the same data to the firm that you're talking to. That's part of what they'll expect in return. Your introductory meetings, you're not buying a car here. You're actually selling your firm's opportunity at the same time you're evaluating whether or not you want to proceed with the other firm. So make sure that you recognize that you want to present an attractive opportunity for the firm you're talking to. Most firms have other people they could be talking to or maybe are talking to. So you're in a competition very often. Be ready to talk about how are you going to run the combined practice? Why are you actually pursuing this? Why is this firm of interest to you? what makes your firm unique, a good opportunity for them, especially if you're bringing in potentially new partners. At the same time, you want to find out what the seller's motivations and their desired objectives are. What is it that's causing them to be in this conversation with you in the first place? Because that's going to drive how they proceed. If they're interested in retiring in just a few years, needless to say, their big deal is going to be probably how much am I going to get paid, and are you going to keep my clients? And what risk do I run with respect to you keeping the clients, and how does that factor into the deal? If on the other hand they're looking for a long-term career opportunity, what about what they have isn't satisfactory? What is it they're looking for? Your goal should be to have no more than 1 or 2 meetings before you really start talking about the meat of a transaction. Now that's going to depend on who you're meeting with. If you're talking to a firm that has 6 partners and you can't get, you realize that before you can really do anything, you need to talk to more than just the one managing partner. You can't proceed until you actually have meetings with the others as well. But try to limit the amount of introductory meetings you have. The best firms doing acquisitions tend to be able to get into a meaty conversation about deal terms fairly quickly. When it comes to non-binding, we like to use a non-binding offer letter or memo for an acquisitions. And generally what you're going to talk about in that is what's the general deal structure, how much you're going to pay and so forth. What's the partner role while they're in transition, and how are you going to pay them for that? What's the business plan for the combination so that they understand how you're going to operate the practice? How you're going to deal with their existing facilities, and be ready to talk about how long you think this is going to take and what the next steps are. When you're dealing with deal terms, be ready to talk about pricing. What I'm primarily talking about here is the multiple, how much you're willing to pay for the transaction. How are you going to deal with retention? Is it going to be a collection deal? We're going to talk about these in detail in just a minute. Is it going to be a collection deal? Or how are you going to deal with retention adjustments for their clients? Are you going to offer them any kind of bonus for new business that they bring into the firm after the transaction? What's the tax treatment of the payments? And how are you going to treat their receivables, WIP, and furniture and fixtures? Keep in mind that when we talk about a deal being at 1x, for instance, 1 times revenues, that's only the intangible value, and there's still the tangible value of the practice, which is primarily going to be work in process and accounts receivable. So that's on top of it in most deals. Another issue on LOIs versus offer letters. We use offer letters rather than LOIs. The reason why we try to avoid a letter of intent is because it's a contract that typically needs to be signed by both parties. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have an LOI. I do recommend that you start with something less formal than that. It can be bullet points, term sheet kind of thing, but nothing that neither side has to sign. Get the business issues, get the basic deal terms in place, and then introduce an LOI after you've had that agreement if you feel like it's still necessary. That's a contract, and what it tends to do is it tends to elevate the conversation, brings in the lawyers. It can really slow down the process, and it's a really poor way to negotiate what really should be just basic deal terms and business terms. So we tend to try to avoid starting with an LOI. In mergers, keep in mind that a big part of this is going to be your owner agreement. So be ready to share with, either give them the owner agreement to evaluate, or at least share the highlights of it with them so they understand what it means to them. Make sure you understand what equity you're going to offer, and what does that really mean in your firm? How important is equity? Is it only something that's used for voting, or does it actually drive compensation and buyouts? If it only drives voting, how important really is it how much equity you offer? I'm not saying don't pay any attention to it, just don't make it into a bigger deal than it really is. Be ready to talk about compensation issues, how much you're willing to, how you pay your partners, and how you're going to deal with their compensation when they first join the firm, what capital contributions they're going to make, and so forth. The issue I want to talk about on due diligence is we recommend that due diligence not be started until after the deal terms have been agreed to, either in an offer letter or an LOI. And the reason for that is that when we're talking about due diligence now, this level of due diligence is field due diligence. It's fairly invasive. It's when you're in their offices going through work paper files and other types of files. It's when you're asking for copies of contracts. You don't need that stuff to be able to put together a term sheet to negotiate the basic terms of the deal. Due diligence at this point, at this level, is more of a verification of what you already know. If you need to know something in order to proceed, ask the question, don't ask for verification for it. We find very few deals fall apart in due diligence. So the problem runs into, we'll do due diligence, then we'll make an offer. A lot of times that'll bog the process down and maybe even kill the process. The other thing I want to point out is don't use an agreement as a tool for negotiating deal terms. If you have, I'm not saying you can't negotiate terms once an agreement is in the process of being developed, but if you run into a major stumbling block, talk about that over the phone or in emails or something like that. The worst thing you can do is have your lawyer redline an agreement where you're actually changing basic terms in the transaction and send that out. That just sends people over the edge. So if there's something that's wrong with the agreement, we need to deal with changing what amounts to a fairly significant term. Have a conversation with that. Don't send a red line change in the agreement. When it comes to transition, think about transition in our, we've got the deal closed and we're post-closing transition. Think about continuity in two terms. One is what we call behind the door, and the other is in front of the door. And behind the door are the things that the clients aren't aware of that are important to how you operate the practice. So the client doesn't care what tax system you use, tax software you use. The client doesn't care about the time and billing system, doesn't care about what your technology infrastructure is. Those are things that primarily affect staff and partners. And so when you make those kinds of changes, keep in mind that what you're primarily dealing with there is staff retention and partner retention, and how fast you make those changes, that's where the impact's going to be felt. Where you really want to be careful is in front of the door. Those are the things that it changes the client experience. The more change you introduce to the clients, and the quicker you introduce it, the more you're pushing and risking the possibility that they're going to say, wow, that's a lot of change, that's not what I signed up for. So a lot of times, if you can, try to postpone those kinds of changes. The 5 questions that every client is going to think of, whether they ask the question or not, when they talk to the seller about this, and this is where you can help the seller prepare themselves for this communication. Are my fees going to change? Are the people I'm working with going to change? Are the services you're offering going to change? In other words, can you still do what I came to you to have done? And don't assume that they're going to say that's yes just because you're a CPA firm. How much other change are you going to introduce? For instance, is your office moving? The way you serve me going to change? The way you bill me, is that going to change? And then finally, is this a good deal for you? If the seller can answer all of those questions in a way that's satisfactory to the client really isn't going to care too much about this transaction. And it helps the sellers understand that there's not as much risk here as they might think if they just think of the communication in those terms. This is our final polling question. Nikki?
Okay, it's on your screen. What issues do you see affecting your practice most next year? Here your options are succession for retiring partners, admitting new partners, client retention for retiring partners, or a need for growth. This is our 4th and final polling question. I'll keep it open about 5 more seconds, just for the last few who haven't answered. There we go. We've got everyone. I'll share the results here. 74% need for growth, not surprising given today's topic. 11% each for the succession for retiring partners or admitting new partners, and then 4% said client retention for retiring partners.
Okay. Again, if you attend the webinar that I'm going to do in October. I think we'll get into a lot of the issues related to succession. So for those of you that have that on your list, even if that might be second on your list, you might think about attending that one. So let's talk about what everybody does usually on everybody's mind. The three questions that we get typically in every one of our webinars is, and conferences that we speak at, what's the multiple? The second one is, what's the multiple? And the third one is, what's the multiple? We're going to primarily address this from the standpoint of acquisitions. Remember that value in your owner in a merger is primarily defined by your owner agreement. So if you pay 3 times comp over 10 years, that defines the value, and that's unique to your situation. Somebody else who pays 2.5 times comp obviously is going to pay a lower. There's a lower value associated with that owner agreement. So when we talk about in an acquisition, which would be an outright acquisition or a two-stage deal, there's 5 components to the terms that all have to fit together and sort of define the value from the standpoint of the terms. The first is any cash up front and all the investment that's made up front. So we're talking, generally how much of a down payment is made, and we don't see down payments nowadays that ever exceed really about 15%. And generally that's only going to be in an immediate sale, and it generally is going to depend on the time of year. So needless to say, you're going to pay more in the way of a down payment if the transaction is closing in December than you'd be willing to pay in May, where you're just coming out of the most profitable time of the year for the practice that you just acquired, who might actually operate at a loss for the rest of the year. So time of year makes an issue, or makes a difference. And the other issue to keep in mind is the receivables. So how you deal with receivables, it's an add-on part of the value. If you're going to pay 1x, typically the receivables in most practices runs somewhere around 25% of volume. So really you're talking about the overall value being about 1.25 times the revenues. Historically in sales, the seller has retained the receivables, and you didn't ever get involved with them, so you just had to replace them as you operated the practice. Nowadays, there's a little more creativity oftentimes used with receivables, and sometimes buyers are asking sellers to let them use the receivables for a year or 2 or even longer and get paid back over time with those, a lot of times with interest. So that can affect dramatically the cash flow. And actually, believe it or not, we've had sellers who really wanted a down payment who were willing to let the buyer keep the receivables for a period of time in exchange for getting a down payment. Now, you might say that's illogical, but sometimes that's the way sellers think. When it comes to retention, the adjustment for retention, for client retention, generally we're looking at collection deals. 20% for 5 years is a collection deal. We see very few deals that are fixed deals where, although there may be somewhat of a guaranteed floor sometimes used, that'll run sometimes as high as 60%, maybe 65%. It might actually increase. The guaranteed floor might increase as the deal goes forward. So we might have a lower guarantee the first year with a higher guarantee the second year. And then limited guarantees would be something like a 2-year retention adjustment. The issue there is, how do you measure retention over those 2 years? And keep in mind that what you'll probably want to do is make sure that you're measuring retention at the end of those 2 years based on the clients that are retained at the end of those 2 years, as opposed to using an average for those 2 years. Because if you use an average, you'll end up including in the average clients that have been lost during those 2 years. When it comes to profitability, which is the third component, the key issue here is not the seller's profitability, although that is an indicator. The most important issue is your own profitability. So what impact this is going to have on your profitability should be what's driving your evaluation of value. On the length of the payout period, what we're really managing there is the cash flow. So a deal that's got, you might be willing to pay a higher multiple if you can get a longer payout period. So instead of paying 20% for 5, if you could pay 17% for 6, you're going to increase your cash flow each year, but you've actually given the seller a higher multiple. So the length of the payout period can be a way to manage or negotiate these deals. Oh, getting back to profitability, also the tax treatment of the payments is a part of that profitability evaluation. So a deal that is treated as goodwill, requires an amortization over 15 years, whereas a deal that's deductible as paid will provide you better cash flow. So the result of all that is the multiple, and the multiple is really the effect. The other four terms are the cause. So a way to think about this is that if you're dealing with a lower down payment, a longer payout period, a longer retention period for a deal that has higher profitability for you, that should or could result in you're offering a higher multiple than a deal that's the opposite. So the seller wants a large down payment or wants a very short retention period on the client retention. You might be willing to accommodate those things in exchange for a lower multiple, or in exchange for another part of the terms that's a trade-off. For instance, maybe you're willing to offer a goodwill deal if you can pay for it over 10 years because that's closer to the amortization period. What are the trends? Clearly, multiples are down, I think, across the board when it comes to acquisitions. We're seeing very few deals done at 1.5, or it's not that common to see 1.25, except in very large markets nowadays. We're seeing a delay in paying for working capital, or their sellers or buyers asking to use the working capital, as I mentioned before. But we're also seeing more creative uses of capital gain treatment on deals. So, transactions that are using capital gains. And then valuations and mergers. Keep in mind that your owner agreement, as I said, is what defines the value in a merger. So as you go out to market, maybe you've got a really low value in your owner agreement because that's what's the most conservative thing for you, but it may be difficult to sell that to potential upstream merger candidates. We're running out of time here, so I'm going to skip through to this two-stage deal transaction real quickly, go through this. This is a technique we use in a lot of deals. The two-stage deal, stage one is the period of time that the seller, who comes in as what looks like a partner but is technically not a partner, typically is not given equity in the deal. Stage one is usually going to be no more than 5 years. Oftentimes we shoot for maybe 2 or 3 years. And during that time frame, the seller is working full-time and continuing to be paid like they have historically been paid. So if they've been making 35% on their volume, you might continue to pay them 35% of the collections on their clients. And at the same time, you're not paying for the practice during this period of time. So you're basically creating a transition period during which the clients and the rest of the practice are going through a powerful transition to your firm because it looks just like a merger. And then during stage one, they're continuing to work. But then during stage two is when they go to a part-time role, or maybe even not working at all. And that's when they go into a standard sort of buyout arrangement. The beauty of this is that even though client retention should still be a component of the buyout, the risk of losing clients has been dramatically diminished because of the transition that the clients have gone through while they've been with the seller. I recommend you look at these articles. You can get them on our website for more information about what we've been talking about today. The Journal of Accountancy has a very good website on succession planning that we help them build. Sorry, right here. And finally, I'm a member of the CPA Consultants Alliance, which offers a lot of information for CPA firms in all kinds of areas. You may recognize some of these consultants' named on here that we're partners with in this group. So with that, I'll give it back to Nikki. Thanks for your attention today.
Hey, thanks so much, Terry. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Just a quick reminder that the survey will come up right when I close the webinar here, so please take a moment to complete that before you close your browser. If for some reason you need to sign off right away, I know that we started a couple minutes late, and I apologize for that. You can email me at that email address, or again, by just replying to any of those emails from GoToWebinar, and I can send you the link to complete the survey at a later time if you do need to leave now. I'll go ahead and end the webinar. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope that you'll join us for another session.